Thank you very much, then, for the invitation. Personally, I'm learning a great deal of sustainable finance and different perspectives in this conference. I prepared this country report Ireland along with Professor Blanette Clark, who unfortunately was unable to join the conference this time. And of course, she apologized for that, and she also sends you many greetings. I have structured the presentation in a very basic way. I will talk a little bit about institutions and basic initiatives in Ireland in relation to sustainable finance, and then I will address selective issues in the questionnaire, particularly now that there is time pressure. So I will not address section 1 on shareholder engagements, and I will address portfolio governance and product governance and also selective issues there. Please, I refer you to the report that we submitted. All the information is there. So the Government of Ireland, the department involved is the Department of Finance. It has the strategy started in 2019, Ireland for Finance, and just basically to bring the financial sectors industry in Ireland internationally in a high level by 2025. One of the pillars of that strategy is sustainable finance. The Central Bank of Ireland basically has central banking duties, and also is the single financial sector regulator in Ireland. So everything that we talk about sustainable finance, or most of it, has to do with the central bank. Other agencies are important for sustainable finance, and also that we look at in preparing the report is the Irish Auditing and Accounting Service Authorities that deals with transparency directive issues, of course, financial information. The Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement, they supervise compliance with company law, the 2014 Company Act, and is also actually very important because it's the designated NCA for the non-financial reporting directive in Ireland. So definitely this agency will increase in importance from the perspective of sustainable finance. And well, so there are some representative bodies very active at the moment: the Irish Association of Investment Managers and the Irish Funds Industry Association. The first of one is a representative body for the investment management industry and has 19 firms of investment managers as members. And the second association is a representative body for the international investment fund community. These are some of the rules that we included in the report. They are all transposed European Union directives from top to bottom, transposed MiFID II, transpose Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, transpose UCITS Directive, then the transpose SR Directive, transpose non-financial disclosure non-financial reporting directive, and also we have used some of the codes and guidance that have been issued by the central bank that are relevant for the topic. Initiatives. Climate Risk and Sustainable Finance Forum. This is an initiative, recent initiative by the Central Bank of Ireland, basically to gather different stakeholders, meaning the government, the central bank, the business actors and associations, just in my view, given the title, to discuss issues on how climate risk affects the financial sector. This is more related, in my view, or largely related to sustainability risk. I hope that also they deal with issues of sustainable investments and investor protection. The second important initiative, well, this climate forum, actually, last week there was a call for interest in membership of that forum, so it will start working, I assume, the second part of the year. There will be 2 meetings yearly. There will be minutes and published minutes. That is great because then we do have this information that currently we are lacking, so I think it's going to be an important source of information. Sustainable Finance Ireland. This is a public and private initiative that includes also has participation of the government and also of United Nations convened Financial Center for Sustainability Network. And the three basically have produced this island's sustainable finance roadmap. And this is basically the document that the government of Ireland will use to implement the sustainable finance agenda. There are 18 actions in it, and I have cited 2 of them. This is for this year. It's in the agenda of the government of this year to establish an international sustainable finance center of excellence in Ireland in partnership with FS4S. And also a high priority is the training of the workforce in the financial sector. So Sustainable Finance Ireland works with an agency of the government that is called SkillNet that help businesses and is training and has a lot of training activities simply just to make sure that the employees of these financial services and investment fund companies and so on, they are able to operate properly in a context of sustainable finance. A few comments now in relation to portfolio governance. When reading all the questions in the questions that we received, it seems to me that there was an overall approach here. That is that the questions identify these incentives or limitations or problems that prevent funds and fund managers from adequately integrating sustainability strategies in their portfolios and more generally in their business models, like sustainable investment strategy, such as a screening or best-in-class causes a fall in portfolio diversification, and with that a drop in financial performance. Or sustainable investment strategies bring into portfolios a poorer financial performance. That in turn may conflict with the investors' objectives. Or engagement becomes a disincentive, like engagement, like higher costs, or introducing long-term objectives. And of course, this also can affect the financial performance of the funds and collide with the investors' investment objectives. So this is the idea that we see in the different questions. And it happens that as we look at those questions and we prepare a response, the response has this common element across the questions, that is that Irish law has created a framework that allows funds and their managers to exercise discretion. So we have a variety of funds given with different objectives: the passive, the active, the short-term, the long-term, more engagement, less engagement. But the legislation of Ireland doesn't constrain that. It allows discretion to those funds to organize or design those funds according to their business models. And of course, there will be cost considerations, profitability considerations, and so on when they do that. But this is subject to some legal constraints, and this is the ones that we try to highlight. So it's not an unrestricted discretion. A few comments in relation to, before I go to the legal constraints, in relation to assumptions. In those questions, we found that it's very strongly, the questions contain these assumptions, like less diversification, sustainable investment strategies leads to less diversification and then lower returns. Or sustainable investment strategy leads to lower returns. And the questions are phrased that way. There is no problem because, as a matter of fact, they're working the assumption that is okay. But if you look at the literature, in some circumstances, these assumptions may not necessarily hold. The first of the assumptions, I have just cited there one of the papers that says, okay, yes, diversification is affected, but the increased risks that follow is compensated, or sometimes more than compensated, by benefits. So in risk-adjusted returns, actually ESG portfolios perform well. In relation to lower returns, well, there is much more literature there indicating there even literature reviews and meta studies showing that ESG portfolios do perform equal or better than traditional portfolios. Of course, we have to be careful here, as I comment, because the data for these studies is data from the past, and circumstances have changed dramatically. So this is not necessarily means that in the future these portfolios will perform the same way. For example, during the COVID time, actually that favored sustainable finance, in my view. It promoted sustainable finance, but now we are in a very different context that may have the opposite effect. So, well, it's okay to work with this hypothesis, just I wanted to highlight and to note that not always may hold. I think it's ultimately is going to be the call of the asset manager when they are thinking about returns and they are thinking about ESG, whether in their particular situations, how this ESG is affecting return, whether it is in line with highest return or not. Third assumption, investors' best interest equal to highest financial returns, just to put it in a way. And this is in many questions. You feel that the question starts from that assumption. Okay, I think that actually is a quite real assumption. I could say that even in Ireland, the law is working on that basis of that assumption. But we need to understand that also there are sustainability interests out there, sometimes in the way that is the ideal way for sustainable finance. It is the first bullet. I read profit-driven, profit-driven mainstream investors look at ESG investment strategies only if they contribute to maximize short-term profit returns. That would be wonderful, right? That we can say, okay, we make good to the world, and also we earn maximize profit. That would be the ideal situation. And if we have that situation, there is no problem. The problem disappears. I mean, the whole financial system will basically be looking for that. But it's not always the situation. And we have a problem here, the assessment of how well those ESG portfolios perform. And then we have other type of investors that are related to moral or ethical motivations or mixed strategies whereby, and it was mentioned before, they want to make a contribution, but also they are willing to forego profits. And the questions for the law is, well, how do we deal with those sustainability interests, and how then this is reflective in the portfolio? Because the idea, initially, the best result, in my view, from the perspective of sustainable finance, is to have that in the portfolios, that the portfolios reflect that interest. So I'm talking about this because Ireland followed this reason in the law in Ireland. So whatever the design chosen, passive or active, diversified, and so on, asset managers are expected to, and this is the mothership obligation, is comply with the overarching duty of act honestly, professionally, and in the best interest of the fund and of investors. And that duty appears everywhere, in all them, or the transposed legislation, MiFID, UCITS directive, and so on, sometimes with one word more or one less, defined a little bit different, but this is the obligation. Of course, the question, and the most important question that I have realized by working on this study, and I think that it's important perhaps to discuss further, is what is the best interest of the fund and of the investors. And that is basically what will define a great deal of the controversies. And I thank Professor Clark for just bringing that paragraph into the study, because this is, it reflects very well briefly the position of Ireland. This comes from the Fiduciary Duty in the 21st century publication, Ireland Roadmap, and it says the asset manager has no obligation to take into account ESG issues. And this is the first proposition, and this is important to realize, that there is no obligation to introduce sustainability in the portfolios. As a matter of law, then you may wish differently, or they may want to do different, but as a matter of law, there is no obligation. I'm talking about Ireland. Other than, and here come restrictions, when it is required by the client. So of course we will look at the mandates. And we will look at ways in which this sustainability interest is identified, for example, sustainability assessment, suitability assessments, and so on. But well, if there is a clear identification of a sustainability interest, that is, and this is in the mandate, for example, that is a legal restriction. Or it's part of the fund documentation in the prospectus when the fund is designed, and we want to design ESG funds. Okay, it is explained there, and then the investor basically will subscribe to it by way of, so will consent to that by way of subscription to the fund units. Absent those elements, absence of the elements, what is left is that considering issues serves the best interest of the clients or the fund. And here we are left again with what is the interest of the clients of the fund. Our interpretation is basically financial returns. That there is this, the interpretation in Ireland is, if I may say so, is conservative of the fiduciary duty. And here we go. This is the fiduciary duty of corporate directors, is statutory duty from the Company Act. Act in good faith in what the director considers to be the interests of the company, and that duty applies to the board of directors of fund management companies, investment companies, and so on. And the interpretation that there is interpretation in the courts in relation to that particular provision is, and just talking broadly about this, is that acting in the interest of the company, focus on shareholders, the company and shareholders, right, and not explicitly on enlightened shareholder value or any stakeholders' approaches. So it's the conservative approach that those that manage companies, they act to maximize basically the returns for the company and for investors. And then, if that is the case, if the situation is that ESG does maximize, then the fiduciary duty will basically tell the director, well, you have to include that. So while the fiduciary duty doesn't make it compulsory to include ESG, it does tell that in those cases in which ESG is consistent or going the same direction with the company's financial performance, then it's part of your duty to include it. Okay, but this is basically the conservative view, and then it's open to the courts to determine whether taking into account ESG is necessary to act in the interest of the shareholders. We may agree or disagree with that. We may like to be differently, but this is the state of the law. Finally, because it's a little early to say finally, but a few comments in relation to these sections of the questionnaire. So this is timeline that was mentioned earlier in today's conference for the reforms to be implemented at national level. So one of the problems that we found is that when we make the study, all the elements that we look at are pre-reform. And when we look at pre-reform elements, there is very little out there. And for that reason, our own initiative has been to prepare our own very basic questionnaire that we will administer. And this questionnaire has questions for the two associations that I mentioned, in order to see whether we can get some of their insight, knowledge, their private information, because publicly there is no out there. However, you can estimate that the industry is already making steps to introduce those reforms, because the industry tends to move faster than the government in that sense. So, well, if we obtain interesting data from this questionnaire, then we bring this information to the report, and we hope in strengthening the report this way. Largely, as it was the case of Poland, the industry today is engaged with implementation, with disclosure, basically, and the implementation of the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and everything seems to go in this direction. very briefly, if you look at the graph, and this is how the business model in Ireland works for who sits in alternative investment funds. We have the funds and then the fund management companies that manage them. Yet those fund management companies delegate the key functions to, including distribution, to other companies. That these are going to be MiFID companies. So when we talk about MiFID product governance rules and suitability rules, will apply to the distributor. But it doesn't apply to the fund management company to the extent that that company is not delivering investment services. So it doesn't fall into the definition of investment firm. And this is because it simply has delegated those functions. If the fund management company decided not to delegate, yes, to that extent, it will have to get the license, it will be able to operate, and it will be under MiFID II rules, for example, if they would like to distribute their own units. So even though that this is the situation, the associations, the industry in Ireland recommend to the fund management companies to follow MiFID II rules, not for legal reasons, but for commercial reasons and for operational reasons, because of the interaction that there is between the manufacturers and the distributor, that they has to exchange information and so on. So they need to assist then the distributor to comply with the MiFID II obligations, particularly product governance, that this distributor is subject to. Well, because of the time, I wanted to talk a little bit about a case, but I'm not going to do that. What I will say basically is that the government of Ireland have explicitly stated by the governor of the central bank in recent statements that they truly support European legislations and that they are committed to the implementations in Ireland, and they use the term effective implementation. There has been this case in Ireland very recently, very important, that the conclusion in that case, it was a case of conflict of interest, and conflict of interest was found. It's called the Davy case. The central bank had an investigation and it sanctioned the firm. The firm had to be sold. A banking institution had purchased that firm. What the central bank said, the firm has in place all the manuals, all the operations, all the rules to manage conflict of interest, that those rules are not driving the behavior within the company, so they are not following it. So not even the compliance department within the firm knew about the transaction and the conflict of interest. So I think when you talk about effective implementation, they are trying to say, well, when we talk about sustainability and you're going to integrate those sustainability rules, then these rules need to drive the internal behavior of the company. There is just in relation to know your customer and suitability assessment, as in other jurisdictions, there has been this thematic review that has been part of the ESMA's common supervisory action. And if you look at that particular, the findings for Ireland, this is a 2021 review. If you look at the findings for Ireland, they just see how precarious is the situation with suitability assessment in Ireland. So firms have failed to establish a risk-based, I make a few here. So inadequate training frameworks, poor reporting and disclosure to clients, and the failure to establish clear procedures for the identification of potentially vulnerable clients, poor record keeping, with a failure to evidence how suitability assessment was conducted and how information gathered was used to inform the recommendations. So there are many of these weaknesses. Of course, they also identify the strength, but they will say, we have this weakness, and the weakness is important, so this is the first stage of reform, I think, that the industry has to do. Then we have the integration of sustainability here, and well, this will only make things very complex. So well, we will see. We need to ask the firms, the companies, and I will, in the near future, about then how they are going to deal with this issue of sustainability. Finally, fighting greenwashing is policy goal of the Central Bank of Ireland, stated as such, so they will do that. They have all the tools of a central bank in order to do this. I will mention two powers that is specifically related to customer protection. First powers given to the Central Bank of Ireland is to seek redress on behalf of the harmed investors. In those cases in which the financial service provider has breached rules, and then the relevant defaults are there, and you can see how relevant are for investor protections, like charging a customer an amount which the regulated financial service provider is not entitled to charge, or provide a customer with financial services which the customer has not agreed to receive, provide a customer with the financial services which is not suitable, or providing a customer with inaccurate information. All these elements are relevant to greenwashing, that basically we are talking about misleading communications. And finally, now the finally is correct, in the same section we have section 44 that provides this statutory right of action, so action for damages, to the harmed investors. So the investor itself can't just bring a litigation to the court. And actually it's quite advantageous, is based on objective responsibility. Yeah? So there is no need to prove negligence or any state of mind. And as opposed to common law, that also common law allows, of course, private actions, but you need to deal with negligence or negligent misrepresentation, fraud, in relation to false or misleading disclosures. And I cited there a paper of Professor Clark because she has addressed these issues in the banking sector, but they are very much applicable also to the context of greenwashing and sustainable finance. I think that I will stop there. Thank you.